The precise and mere words of Pope Leo XIV about female diaconate and LGBT community in the Church and sexual abuse on zenith.org and Crooks. His mere words in the interview. Journalist Allen. Two of the most prominent hot-button issues that came out of the Synod on synodality in terms of the debate they generated were the role of women in the Church and the Church's approach to the LGBTQ plus community. What were your thoughts on the discussion about these two issues, and how will you approach them in your new role now as Pope? Pope Leo. In a synodal way, for most people, certainly the understanding that the role of women in the Church has to continue to develop, I think in that sense there was a positive response. I hope to continue in the footsteps of Francis, including in appointing women to some leadership roles at different levels in the Church's life, recognizing the gifts that women have that can contribute to the life of the Church in many ways. The topic becomes a hot-button issue when the specific question is asked about ordination. What the Synod had spoken about specifically was the ordination, perhaps of women deacons, which has been a question that has been studied for many years now. There have been different commissions appointed by different popes to say, what can we do about this? I think that will continue to be an issue. I, at the moment, don't have any intention of changing the teaching of the Church on the topic. I think there are some previous questions that have to be asked. Just one small example. Earlier this year, when there was the Jubilee for permanent deacons, so obviously all men but their wives were present. I had the catechesis one day with a fairly large group of English-speaking permanent deacons. The English language is one of the groups where they are better represented because they are parts of the world that never really promoted the permanent diaconate. And that itself became a question. Why would we talk about ordaining women to the diaconate if the diaconate itself is not yet properly understood and properly developed and promoted within the Church? And what are the reasons for that? So while I think there was a significant inspiration at the time of the Council, when the permanent diaconate was in effect reinstated, it has not become, in many parts of the world, what I think some people thought it would be earlier on. So I think there are some questions that have to be asked around that issue. I also wonder, in terms of a comment I made at one of the press conferences I participated in the Synod, in terms of what has oftentimes been identified as clericalism in the present structures of the Church. Would we simply be wanting to invite women to become clericalized? And what has that really solved? Perhaps there are a lot of things that have to be looked and developed at this time before we can ever really come around to asking the other questions. That's where I see things right now. I am certainly willing to continue to listen to people. There are these study groups, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, which has responsibility for some of those questions. They continue to examine the theological background, history of some of those questions, and we'll walk with that and see what comes. Helen. Just a quick follow-up on the LGBTQ plus point. It can be a very ideological issue. However, beyond any ideological views, I think people felt that this was just spoken about in a different way, with a different tone and differences. What will your own approach be? Pope Leo. Well, I don't have a plan at the moment. I was asked about that already a couple of times during these first couple of months about the LGBT issue. I recall something that a cardinal from the eastern part of the world said to me before I was Pope about the Western world being fixated, obsessed with sexuality. A person's identity, for some people, is all about sexual identity. And for many people in other parts of the world, that's not a primary issue in terms of how we should deal with one another. I confess that's on the back of my mind, because as we have seen at the Synod, any issue dealing with the LGBTQ questions is highly polarizing within the Church. For now, because of what I have already tried to demonstrate and live out in terms of my understanding of being a pope at this time in history, I am trying not to continue to polarize or promote polarization in the Church. What I'm trying to say is what Francis said very clearly when he would say, todos, todos, todos. Everyone is invited in, but I don't invite a person in because they are or are not of any specific identity. I invite a person in because they are a son or daughter of God. You are all welcome, and let's get to know one another in respect and respect one another. At some point, when specific questions will come up, people want the church doctrine to change. They want attitudes to change. I think we have to change attitudes before we even think about changing what the church says about any given question. I find it highly unlikely, certainly in the near future, that the church's doctrine in terms of what the church teaches about sexuality, what the church teaches about marriage will change. I have already spoken about marriage, as did Pope Francis when he was Pope, about a family being a man and a woman in solemn commitment, blessed in the sacrament of marriage. But even to say that, I understand some people will take that badly. In Northern Europe, they are already publishing rituals of blessing people who love one another, is the way they express it, which goes specifically against the document that Pope Francis approved, Fiducia Supplicans, which basically says, of course, we can bless all people, but it doesn't look for a way of ritualizing some kind of blessing, because that's not what the Church teaches. That doesn't mean those people are bad people, but I think it's very important again to understand how to accept others who are different than we are, how to accept people who make choices in their life and to respect them. I do understand that this is a very hot button topic, and that some people will make demands to say, we want the recognition of gay marriage, for example, or we want recognition of people who are trans. To say this is officially recognized and approved by the Church. The individuals will be accepted and received. Any priest who has ever heard confessions will have heard confessions from all kinds of people with all kinds of issues, all kinds of states of life and choices that are made. I think that the Church's teaching will continue as it is, and that's what I have to say about that for right now. I think it's very important. Families need to be supported, what they call the traditional family. The family is father, mother, and children. I think that the role of the family in society, which has at times suffered in recent decades, once again has to be recognized, strengthened. I just wonder out loud if the question about polarization and how people treat one another doesn't also come from situations where people did not grow up in the context of a family where we learn that's the first place you learn how to love one another, how to live with one another, how to tolerate one another, and how to form the bonds of communion. That's the family. If we take away that basic building block, it becomes very difficult to learn that in other ways. I think there are some very key elements that need to be looked at. I believe I am who I am because I had a wonderful relationship with my father and my mother. They had a very happy married life for over 40 years. Even today, people comment on this, even my brothers. We are still very close, even though one is far on one end politically, we are in different places. In my experience, that has been an extremely important factor of who I am and how I am even able to be who I am right now.